Alright, so this video is going to talk about the question of apologetics. What is apologetics? Why does it matter? Who cares? Is it just a Christian thing? Is it for Muslims or somebody else? All of those are good questions, and so this will be kind of an introductory question into the what is apologetics whole concept. So let's take it a piece at a time. Now let's ask the first question, what is apologetics? What does it even mean? Well, there are a lot of different understandings of what apologetics looks like, but really and truly what it boils down to is just giving an apology for why you are the way that you are. Now, I do not mean I'm going to apologize for being who I am or what it is that I believe. Instead, we're going to take the term from a dialogue that you would see Socrates, written by Plato, assumably, defending why he was doing what he was doing to the authorities that were putting him on trial for corrupting the youth, and amongst other things. And so he wanted to try and give a defense that explained, this is why I'm doing what I'm doing and why I shouldn't have to die. Well, he was unsuccessful, as we know through history, but maybe the rest of us won't be quite so unsuccessful. And so apologetics really just means defending what, or the art of rather, defending what you believe and why. So you can do Christian apologetics, you can do atheistic apologetics, you can do Muslim apologetics, you can do Hindu apologetics, you can do Houston Rockets apologetics if you want to, LeBron James apologetics. Jordan's better. Anyway, so when we say Christian apologetics, what specifically are we talking about, since this is a site that's specifically focusing on defending the Christian God? Well, what it means, it kind of stands in a tradition that passes on for a very long time, for about 1700 years or so. So if you look at some of the early Christian apologists, they're called Christian apologists, like Justin Martyr. They were talking to the leaders of Rome, and, well, they were being persecuted by the leaders in Rome, and so they really wanted to not be persecuted by the leaders in Rome. I don't blame them. As much as I would like having my skin ripped off, or being butchered alive, or sewn up in a carcass, or you get the idea. It's disgusting. It was gross. Like, really gross, in fact. They didn't want to do that anymore. They thought it was a bad idea. And they thought, you know what? Look, we're not a threat to you people. If loving your neighbor as yourself is a threat to your existence as a country, I guess we have major problems. So stop killing us, please. We're really good people. Just stop killing us. Anyway, so the apologists wanted to present to Caesar and to Rome in general why it is that they should not be considered to be a threat, and varying degrees of success, but ultimately Christianity was legalized in Rome, and so I guess there was a long-term success that took place through the work of the apologists. Well, fast forward to today, what is apologetics today? It's more of the art of defending the Christian faith. So that's what we're trying to do. All right, well, how would you do apologetics? Well, good question. It kind of works itself out in a number of different ways. There are positive types of apologetics, there are negative types of apologetics, and here's what I mean by that. I'm using kind of specific terms that mean different things in different contexts. You'll find that a lot in philosophy and theology. But really what I mean in positive and negative apologetics would be this. If I'm on offense, I'm doing positive apologetics. If I'm on defense, I'm doing, you guessed it, negative apologetics. So it's kind of like on a football field. If I am on offense, I'm trying to score, I'm on positive apologetics in a sense. And if I'm on defense, trying to stop the other team from scoring, I'm doing negative apologetics. So positive apologetics would be me presenting proofs or reasons or information or logical sequence or whatever to try and demonstrate the validity of my position. And if I'm doing negative apologetics, then I'm trying to take what somebody who is contrary to my position or against my position, and I'm trying to deconstruct their arguments so that they do not actually prove what I'm saying to be incorrect. Now, the interesting thing about positive and negative apologetics that we mess up a lot as people, or just positive and negative argumentation really, is a lot of times if you have defeated an argument from somebody else who's trying to prove something, often we will mistake that for, I've made an argument that disproves your case altogether and proves mine, when in fact that's not necessarily the case. So for instance, if I make the argument that it is wet outside and therefore the sprinkler is on, and then you come around and say, wait, the sprinkler wasn't on, so therefore it's not wet outside. No, that's not actually true. It can still be wet outside. You just proved that it wasn't the sprinkler that did it. So you can't overreach on a defense, but you can't overreach on an offense either. Just because you've proven a certain argument, or kind of proven it, in many cases you get stuck in the question of, did you really prove something as much as you think you did? You may have proved a certain point, but that doesn't mean it can be extrapolated further than maybe you think it will. So just because the other side does not have a defense against your position, it doesn't always mean your position is right. Sometimes it does, though. So if you have a logical sequence and you're on offense and you're trying to prove your case, and the other side, they can't prove your argument wrong. They accept your premises, and sure enough, what you're saying, it actually is true. Well, in situations like that, you often can prove your case. But again, it's important to remember, you can't overreach on either side. Know what you're trying to do, when you're trying to do it, and understand the limitations of what you're trying to accomplish. Don't overreach, but don't underreach too. So, all right, the next thing I want to talk about would be deductive and inductive argumentation. So, for instance, if now this is going to get some of the English people a little bit weirded out, because this deductive and inductive can mean different things at different times. The way I'm particularly using it in this context would be as such. A deductive argument would say, I have premises, say, if this is right and if that is right, then this conclusion absolutely must follow. It's logically inescapable for this conclusion to not follow. Okay, that would be what I would call a deductive argument. An inductive argument would say, if this premise is true and that premise is true, then this premise is probably true. And the probability of this premise being true is going to be based upon how positive I am that the first two premises are true. So is the conclusion true? Most likely, depending upon how sure we are of the other 2 points. Now, if I make, let me maybe give some examples of what this looks like. So, if I were to say, all cars are fast. I drive a car, therefore my car is fast. That would be a deductive argument, because it doesn't leave any room for negotiation. It doesn't leave any room for, well, most of the time. It's flat out always true. If all cars are fast, and if I own a car, then logically my car must be fast. That would be a deductive style argument in this context. If I say, most cars are fast, I own a car, therefore my car more likely than not is fast. Well, that would be because one of the premises said, most cars are fast. The teleological argument for God's existence, which is based upon design, a lot of times will use this style argumentation. It's not absolute. It's trying to give a probability, and I'll talk more about this in the teleological argument video that I'll be putting together. But essentially, it goes like this: the universe exhibits design characteristics. Anything that exhibits design characteristics is most likely designed. Therefore, the universe is most likely designed, and the more likely it is to be designed is going to be determined by those things that we call design elements. So in other words, if I go through and I find all of these crazy, impossible things that actually exist and they prove that everything has been designed, well, then the stronger that case is, the stronger the case for the designer existing of the universe itself. So if I say the Earth has to spin exactly the way it is, it has to be the exact difference from a certain planet to another planet, it has to be the exact distance from the sun that it is, it can't wobble. What are the chances of all of this? 1 in 10 trillion. All right, well, I just made a probability argument that it is far more likely, as in 1 chance in a trillion, that God exists than he doesn't, if that makes sense. The more powerful arguments I would suggest would be the deductive arguments, because they don't really leave a lot of room for debate. But humans, for some reason, find the inductive arguments often more helpful or more powerful. Most people who consider themselves Christians, or at least are interested in Christianity and think that there may be some validity, typically will find arguments like the teleological argument to be more profound, even if it isn't necessarily more inescapable of a conclusion. It leaves it a little bit more open. The moral argument often can be presented in this way as well. So in other words, why does morality exist? Well, because humans exist. And the more that humans naturally understand a hierarchy of morals indicates that there must be a moral giver. Now, I don't actually like that presentation of the argument, as I'll explain when I post that video. But at the end of the day, a lot of people are still convinced by that kind of thinking. And again, I'll explain this more as we go on, but you need to understand the difference between deductive and inductive type of argumentation to know what's being proven or not being proven. Also, I want to talk about a priori and a posteriori. And different people will pronounce these different ways, and so that's just simply how I pronounce them because I like pronouncing them that way. The end. A priori, this is going to get weird, so I'm going to try and write it up here so you can actually see the words. But a priori, now you know what, I'm going to start with a posteriori. So a posteriori would be, I can understand or perceive something because I have experience with it in reality. In other words, it's post-reality, it's post-experience. So in other words, I know I can compare a tree to another tree or a car to a cymbal or a drum or whatever else because I've seen them, I have experience with them. So I could be basing an argument upon things I've experienced or known. Or I can go a priori, which would be, it's independent of experience. In other words, you're not dealing with physical things or things that I have experience with. You're dealing with things that are more abstract, more kind of out there. The ontological argument, which is focused on the question of existence of God just on his own being or definition, would be an a priori argument. A posteriori argument would be, again, the teleological argument because you're looking at different physical things in the universe and trying to reconcile that without God's existence or with God's existence. Most human beings will like a posteriori a lot more than a priori because a priori gets into the abstract realm. It gets into stuff that, well, when I post the ontological argument video, it's going to be a little confusing at first. And you'll know when you get it. You'll know when you understand it because everybody has that, I think I get it. Oh, that makes sense. I get it. Now, whether it's valid or not, you may dispute, but it's still a lot more difficult to understand. And many people don't like a priori arguments because we're so grounded in what we perceive to be reality, we fall into the I'm not going to believe it until I see it category, which can be good or bad. Enter optical illusions. Can you really trust what you see? The question of what you know, how can you possibly know what you think you know? Do you see something correctly or not correctly? Well, that's the question of a posteriori. And there are a lot of philosophers that are going to have a lot of challenges to an a posteriori foundation or background. So the big funny thing is that we don't really love a priori arguments. We love a posteriori arguments. But a posteriori arguments, in many cases, seem to be dependent upon our senses, which may be lying to us. What do we do? Me personally, I love a priori arguments because it allows me to get my bias. It allows me to get my fundamental assumptions about reality. I'll believe it when I see it kind of perspective. It'll allow that to go as much by the wayside as possible, and I can be dealing with pure reason itself. I don't happen to be like a lot of people in that way, but nonetheless, when I present all of these arguments, I will try and do so, including all of these different perspectives, whether it's a priori, posteriori, deductive, inductive, etc. And hopefully by the end of it, I will have made a compelling case for God's existence using the classical arguments, but updated to a modern presentation. And more on that as we go along. Okay, the final couple things I want to talk about would be some other terminology that I like to use a lot and that you'll see from time to time in these debates. One is the question of epistemology. We were just talking about this. Do you remember when I asked the question, how do you know what you know or think you know? That's the question of epistemology. Knowledge, the study of knowledge is literally what it means. How do you know what you think you know? Have you seen optical illusions? Because they tell you your eyes will lie to you given the chance. In fact, there's a lot of studies that have been done that suggest that your eyes are always lying to you. The question is not how much are they lying to you, the question is how much are they actually telling you the truth? What you see is not actually what is in front of you or is not actually what's happening. Just ask the scientists dealing with quantum mechanics how confusing the senses can be in traditional common sense, if you will. Look at politics. If you think that common sense makes a lot of sense to most people, well, we have, politics. Anyway, so how do you know what you know? It's one of my favorite questions to ask. And it's really difficult to make a coherent argument if you don't at least have some sort of a sense of, this is how I know what I think I know. Okay, so let's ask that question. Let's figure out where we're coming from. Another term that I think is worth talking about is the question of metaphysics. Now, you may be saying, yeah, but I didn't like physics to begin with, so why would I like metaphysics, whatever in the world that means? That's a great question. Well, all right, so let's break it down. Metaphysics, meta would be kind of overarching, and then physics, well, we know what physics would be. It would be the physical world and motion of objects and so forth. When you're dealing with metaphysics, you're asking questions about two different main categories. The first would be, well, it doesn't really matter the order, but one is going to be cosmology. Now, you should know that root, cosmos, which is the universe. It's the entire created world in a sense, or if you're not a theist, then it would be the entire existence of things that exist. Or maybe it's just our cosmos and not other cosmos. Either way, metaphysics is asking the ultimate, what exists, what is this stuff, and can we study it and know more about it? Now, the weird one's going to be ontology. You heard me say ontological argument? Well, the word ontology is kind of what was used for that. Ontology really deals with the question of the nature of being or existence, substance itself. This is abstract, this is weird, this is really hard to explain to people that are not saturated in philosophy. I'll try and do my best average person explanation. So, if you're dealing with the question of objects that are not necessarily physical and real, concepts, like the concept of one, the concept of an omnipotent being transcendent of the universe, outside of time, what does that even mean? You're dealing with the question of ontology, the nature of existence itself. Why does something exist as opposed to not exist, just in general? Those are questions of ontology, by and large. I kind of skewed it a little bit, but you get the idea. Those are questions that ultimately will be dealing with metaphysics and that are the central focus of apologetics itself. So, I think that pretty much covers it. That's going to be our introduction, basic terms, basic understandings of things that we'll need to know. The last thing I want to do is just talk a little bit about some logical fallacies that I think that we'll see along the way that we want to avoid. If you see me doing this, I hope that you will call me out on it, because I will call other people out on that. It's just something that it always takes a good reminding to stay away from these types of things. So, logical fallacies would be, you constructed a great logical argument, except you didn't, because you messed something up. Well, a fallacy would be a faulty argument. And there are two main categories of fallacies. You have kind of a structural type of fallacy, which would be called a formal fallacy. So, for instance, let's say that I have what's called a syllogism, which a syllogism would be you have premises listed out. If this is true, if this is true, if this is true, then, or therefore, or thus, or something like that, this conclusion must or most likely follows. That's a syllogism. If I have a syllogism that I've put together, and I'm really proud of my syllogism, but I have a structural error in this, that's called a formal fallacy. It doesn't matter if I happen to be right. My argument is still dumb. It's still messed up. So let me give an example of something that would be considered a formal fallacy. There's something called circular reasoning, or begging the question. So if I were to say, the Bible says God exists. The Bible can be trusted. Therefore, God must exist. That's called circular reasoning. You cannot actually make an argument that is in any way valid because you're making one big circle that relies upon itself to make its case. So, for instance, you're saying, first and foremost, the Bible can be trusted. Well, if I can trust the Bible, if the Bible is absolutely true, and the Bible does say God exists, then sure, God must exist. That's a good argument. Except no one's going to accept, if you're not a Christian, obviously, and even if you are a Christian, sometimes Christians don't accept absolute inerrancy or there's no errors whatsoever in the Bible. I'm not getting into that discussion right now. I'm just saying that is not something that everyone accepts to be true, and yet you used it as a fundamental principle that is true. You started with, Bible says God exists, Bible can be trusted, therefore God exists. Yeah, but you're relying upon different parts of that argument to make your case. And it's a big circle is what it is, and somebody who knows what they're doing is going to call you out on it. You cannot make that argument. It is a fundamentally flawed argument. Another example of a fallacy would be something like this. Let's go back to the whole raining outside question. If it's raining outside, the ground will be wet. Okay, seems fair so far. Where are we going with this? The ground is wet. Therefore, it must have rained outside. No, that doesn't work. There could have been a sprinkler on. Someone could have just poured a bunch of water on the ground. There could be any number of things. And so what you have done is you've actually made a statement that may be true. It may be wet outside, but you flipped those reasonings. So if it's raining outside, the ground will be wet. Let's just say that that's going to always be true. That doesn't necessarily mean that's the only way the ground can be wet. So you're affirming the consequent is what it's called. Anyway, so those are formal fallacies. Those are structural fallacies. But you also have a multitude of informal fallacies that you have to watch out for. Some big ones would be things like this. Ad hominem, which is commonly stated all over the place. You'll see this one in politics pretty much anytime there's a debate, and that is against the person, or you're basically challenging somebody's argument because you're saying they're dumb, or how could they possibly know something like that? They're stupid. So if you were to say, I think that we should vote for socialism, and I say, what would you know? You're not even educated. Okay, so let's say that you're not educated. That doesn't mean that you might not have actually stumbled upon a correct statement of argument. I at least have to take it into consideration. I can't just pretend like your argument doesn't exist, because even a child may stumble upon the correct argument from time to time. I at least need to be able to discount your argument. Unless, of course, it's so absurd it's not worth dealing with, in which case that's a whole different discussion. Einstein was, I think, dismissed because, well, that's just so silly. It's not. Was it that silly? Maybe not. Anyway, there are other arguments. Another big political argument problem, or really any time, we do this. Kids do this with their parents too. Would be straw man argument. The straw man argument would be essentially this: you take an argument that was made against your position, and then you relay that argument, or you try and represent that argument in such a way that no reasonable person would ever believe it. You've misrepresented the validity or the power of their argument so that you have an easy time of dismissing it. One of the things that I like to do, if possible, is to do the exact opposite. If I'm going to be presenting someone else's argument, I want to present it better than they can. Now, if I can't do it better than they can, I'd like to at least do it as well as they can. And I like to confirm, is this actually what you were saying? Did I present this accurately? Because if I can deconstruct it after I presented the opposite of a straw man, then my rebuttal suddenly has way more power and way more meaning. Usually people will do straw mans if they're stuck in a soundbite in like a political environment, or they will present a straw man if they know that their point is weak or they didn't understand the argument that was being made against them, in which case you just look foolish. So we like to avoid those. I'll give maybe one more example of a logical fallacy. Two more. I'm going to give two more examples. Red herring fallacy. So let's say that we're debating about God's existence, and then you bring up something. I'm trying to prove God's existence, and you bring up something seemingly similar, but really not the same thing. This is something that I've seen quite common, and that would be this. Let's say I'm a Christian, you're an atheist, and you're saying, or I'm saying God exists. And you say, okay, I don't think you're right. And I say, well, why is that? Present to me why it is God can't exist. And then you say, well, the Bible was written over 2,000 years. It's full of, errors. How could we possibly believe that? Well, historically, what I see the Christian doing at this point would be, Well, no, the Bible's right, and going down the rabbit trail, as if saying the Bible is inaccurate in any way has anything to do with God's existence. See, at the end of the day, if I'm trying to prove God's existence, I have not actually said the Christian God, the triune God, Father, Spirit, Son. I haven't said that at all. All I've actually said was an omnipotent being that created everything. Heck, even some theists don't even believe in an omnipotent being. So we have to define, what do we mean by God? And if I even say the Christian God, Father, Son, and Spirit, heck, even if I had said that, just because the Bible may or may not have errors in it, which we can talk about later, that even doesn't mean that that specific God doesn't exist. It's a red herring. It comes from the idea of taking this just disgustingly smelly fish, more often than not over in Britain, and dragging it across the lane so that the dog hunting you would be kind of taken off by the scent because it's so potent, or at least losing your scent. It's a diversionary tactic. And it's not always intended to be a diversionary tactic. It's not that often that a red herring is done on purpose. More often than not, it's actually done by accident, and everything just gets confusing after that. And so what we want to do in argumentation, no matter what we're arguing about or debating, I don't mean arguing in like a bad way. I mean, when I say argument, I mean good old-fashioned debating where two people who disagree are discussing something. It builds knowledge, it builds camaraderie, it builds all kinds of things. Usually you should be friends after a good argument, not enemies. If you're enemies, you're doing it wrong. We got to watch out for red herrings. We don't want to get lost in the weeds and realize that what you said, actually, that took us way off track. That has nothing to do with what we're talking about. Even if you're right about that, that's not going to disprove my point. Stay on track. Don't get off that track. One last one I'm going to use is equivocation. So this one, this is kind of a fun one, especially in today's political climate. I guess really any political climate. So I've heard it said once or twice. It said, so this country, America, is a republic, not a democracy. Therefore, we should all be voting Republican. And that's an obvious case of, okay, yes, it's a republic, but republic and Republican are not used the same. You can't let your terms drift. You can't let the idea of what you're saying shift and morph into something else. Think of a syllogism where you're piecing together an argument. If a term keeps changing every single time you use it, even slightly, you will have a conclusion that is invalid because you have equivocated ever so slightly but meaningfully a definition for a term that you're using for a proof. You have to keep your terms meaning the same thing from start to finish. Otherwise, you have invalidated your argument. You may even have a right conclusion. But if your argument is invalid, then there's no reason to actually believe it. All right, so we've talked about the question of apologetics, what apologetics is, what it's like, some of these definitions that would be important to it. And we've also talked about some logical fallacies so that we can engage in a discussion in a meaningful way and try and stay away from fallacies. All right, I will see you in the next video, and I appreciate you watching this one. If you want to hit the like. If you have a comment or anything that you want to say, then please leave the comments below. I'm always interested in seeing what you think about this, or if there's anything I forgot or anything that I misspoke. I would love to know. Anyway, take care. See you next time.